we're about to get a lot heavier. And no, I don't mean because of my poor dietary choices. Although those could use some addressing. No, I mean because it's time to select the face panel. You want your appearance face laid down on the ground so that you can secure it to that inner bed frame. And this time, I think I'm actually gonna do the edge banding when I'm supposed to. Growth. Edge banding was made a lot easier using some clamps to help the panel stand up on edge. You do the two long outer edges. No need to do the middle, obviously, because these panels are going to be side by side. And then you do the top edges, which is really the foot of the bed, as well. Now that we have the edge banding on, it's time to lay the appearance face down and go ahead and take our main bed frame and lay it on top of the panels and work to align it so that there's a 1/4 inch margin along both finished long edges. The main goal for this step is so that you can trace the inside and outside of all of those struts and the bed frame so that you know where it's safe to put glue for when it's time to fasten these two things together. A special note, as you're aligning and fastening, the instructions are pretty explicit that they want the rounded side rails to be flush with the foot rail end, which is where you see me standing now. And on the opposite end, the face panel can actually extend about a 1/4 inch or so you have a little wiggle room. But if you're gonna make it perfectly flush anywhere, you want it to be at that rounded side rail end, which is the foot of the bed. The absolute best way to get perfect alignment for this step is to start in that top right corner marked X on the diagram, keeping it flush with the foot rail the entire time, and then moving to that opposite front corner and doing the exact same thing. If you need to pull it at all, you can use a trigger clamp to secure that middle section before you move down to the lower corners marked Z on the diagram. If you need to rack it into place at that point, you can, and you'll see I do opt to use a little rubber mallet to give it a little love tap. That way it maintains that 1/4 inch margin around those long edges before I begin to make a ton of pre-drilled holes all throughout each strut to get this thing completely fastened down to the face panel. Measure 6 inches down from the top and 7 3/8 inches in from the finished edge. Drill a 5/16 inch diameter by 1/2 inch deep hole. You can do this with a regular drill bit using some tape as your depth stop if you don't have a drilling guide. This is the exact step that had me most intimidated to do this Murphy bed build, which is silly. But the creators of the instruction manual recommend doing this with a plunge router. I have one of those. It's in my router table, and that's why I prefer it stays. I decided to do this a completely different way that was comfortable for me and I thought would be a lot more approachable to many more people. I pretty much used the measurements provided and some good old-fashioned tracing to figure out exactly where the pocket would need to be so that I could use a basic Forstner bit in combination with my drilling guide from Milescraft and pocket out the center for this piece. I felt way more comfortable doing this, and although it required some chisel work, it was actually pretty fun and I did enjoy doing it. So I would highly recommend ditching the plunge router, especially because you may not even have one, and doing it this way. Just for your reference, I will put a link to this specific drilling guide that I'm using in the description of the video in case you want to use that same one. When you go to test fit this piece of hardware, do not forget to put some wax in the pocket and on the hardware itself. You will have a much easier time fitting it. Time to drill again, so I'm placing a piece of scrap wood on the back side to avoid having tear out. Here I'm measuring 4 3/4 inches from the front edge banded side and up 11 3/4 inches from the bottom so that I can drill the 5/8 inch hole for the male pivot plate. Again, this one only has a 1/2 inch depth, so I'm using my drilling guide with the built-in depth stop. And again, this hardware is meant to fit nice and snug, so a little bit of paste wax or some kind of wax goes a long way. Use a square to check the positioning of the pivot plate before you mark your holes for drilling, and then you'll get to work fastening this on. Another quick note here, this is the point in time where if you needed to adjust this for baseboard, you could be notching out the back corner of this as well if you don't want to pull baseboard off of your wall. This camera angle isn't ideal, but I wanted you guys to see a lot of the hardware in this kit. 2 of the 4 fasteners are usually machine screws that fasten through T-nuts. So that's pushing those T-nuts through the back side and then putting that male pivot plate back in place so that I can use machine screws to go ahead and fasten that on. All right, we are getting there. Let's assemble this header board, and let's make sure we do it with the finished edge facing up or down, depending on how you want to look at it. This is the side you'll see when you're laying in the bed. It needs a 1/2 inch lip, and so right now I'm actually putting some lines on there using my combination square so that I know exactly where I can put the glue. And here's a little fun fact about me. I generally like to do things the hard way instead of asking for help. Of course, no one else is here at the moment. I've got to do it myself. So here's how I did it. I chose to use my brad nailer to just pop a few brads, specifically one on the end so that it could act as a pivot point. And that way I could check and make sure that 1/2 inch lip was perfect the whole way down. Then I would go back and add some fasteners. The reason this side gets actual fasteners attached to it and not just brad nails like you'll see in the next step is because this is the rear portion of the header board, which means this is the part that's actually going to be fastened to the studs and hold your bed in place. This right here is the front side of your header board, which means this is the appearance face. So no screws are going in this side. We're doing the glue, and then we're gonna hit it with 2-inch brad nails and just simply put some clamps on for 30 minutes or so to let that glue really take hold, and that's gonna be the strength that this side needs. I make sure I'm not shooting these through it. From all blessings flow. Let's go. So realizing something now that could have made this part easier for me, so I'm going to make sure to include this for you to make it easier for you. The mounting cleats, those are, I used offcuts from the inner bed frame, just pine. They have to be solid wood, but those are the perfect opposing spacers. So if you don't have a 1/2 inch spacer to line up these rails for the header board, you can actually just flip it over, like I said, work with it upside down, but instead just have your mounting cleats on your workbench. And you can be resting this right on top of this. This is your 1.5 inch piece, and it's the difference. So if you don't have a 1/2 inch, you can just use your 1.5 inch mounting cleat to set it up. This will rest right on top of it. You can get that fastened on there like that. You know what I'm saying? Oh my gosh. I wish I would have thought of that before I started that part. Not a big deal, but the instructions don't word it that way. So hopefully that'll help you. And maybe I'll make a note to my friends at Create-A-Bed to say, hey, there's dummies out there like me trying to build a Murphy bed, and a little tip like this would be super helpful. So, all right, I'm gonna try that next time. Speaking of mounting cleats, let's get these installed. We'll throw some glue on and put some fasteners in here as well. But this is why I mentioned using this as your item that props up your plywood for the fastening of the two side pieces you see here in the last step. If the instructions might have you install the mounting cleats first, as long as you know that they're flush, that would allow you to simply rest your other pieces on the table and not have to fuss with brad nails and spacers and things like that, like I did. So as you're fastening on this mounting cleat, go ahead and not only should you countersink it, but also do a pilot hole with a longer bit. When you're working with pine like this, the last thing you want is to split it right here at this moment. So take the time to do it right. Time to remove all that hardware you worked so hard to install earlier. Take off those labels, although keep in mind, if you're not sure what the parts are, you do not want to get mixed up at this point. So add an extra label to the bottom where no one will ever see it, just in case. Of course, you got to sand if you're going to paint this piece, and even if you're going to stain it too. It's made a lot easier with this type of a sander because you can get right up along the edges, and with a foam sanding pad, you can get a nice eased edge just to soften it up. And now we can prep for painting or whatever finish you ended up choosing.